Many years ago, back in the day, back in the 80s, whenever I saw this image first appear on the television screen, I knew something neat was coming. And I hope that you're going to find what you're going to see today to be really neat. So don't touch that dial. If you do touch the dial, just keep in mind that back in the 80s, I was flipping the dial on a lot of times up that higher band on the UHF. Back in the 1980s, I would watch television a lot of times in the kitchen with my half-brother John. Back then, we called him TJ. And this is not, of course, the exact television set, but in your imagination today, just keep in mind that it might look something like this, but kind of a little bit different. Now, back in the day, I lived in Jacksonville, Florida. And back then, there were these TV stations that were independent TV stations. Back in the 1980s, there was this growth of independent television, stations that weren't affiliated with networks. So here we have Channel 30, WAWS. Now, this station would eventually become the Fox affiliate. But back in the day, back in the 80s, in the afternoons especially, this was one of the sources of my entertainment. Now, also, in 1983, there was Channel 47. Now, it was going to convert from being a religious station in 1983 to being an independent station. So it started out actually as WXAO and then became WNFT. Now, where I lived was in Mandarin, off of Dimsdale Road, and back then, I was able, through the way my dad had everything set up, even in the kitchen, on just some TV with no cable connection, was able to get some good reception. Okay? Now, we had cable in our living room, but a lot of my TV watching in the afternoon was in the kitchen. And so I was always flipping between 30 and 47. Here's a story of a lovely lady who was bringing up three very lovely girls. Okay, so I would have to say the cornerstone of my TV viewing, as a lot of people can, certainly of my age, can relate to, was the Brady Bunch. And now a lot of the shows I watched were long past their first run, and they were in syndication. And the Brady Bunch, that was a show that initially premiered on ABC television in 1969. It went off the air in 1974, 1 year before I was born. But I was always watching the Brady Bunch. And so you have this big family, okay, characters playing this big family in this big house, and everything just seemed to be resolved within 30 minutes, including commercials. And I really, really enjoyed this show. And I know there are a lot of you out there watching who did. And of course, you have the home out there in California. Of course, believe it or not, in some ways I lived in, I wouldn't say a similar house, but I could relate to the ranch house concept of where I lived, where I was watching television. And it was really kind of showing that upper middle class life. And a lot of times you would see it and go, wow, everything just seemed, no matter what happened, it seemed to kind of work out well on the Brady Bunch. So I was always watching these shows, and I really got a lot out of it. And of course, we would know later on in the 1990s, there was this big resurgence of interest in the Brady Bunch and in the characters and the actors and the actresses. And I really was impressed by Ralph Reed and Florence Henderson, particularly playing the parents. And it was something neat, but it was something you looked at and went, wow, you know. And so, but even back then, also too, one of the early shows I watched was from the late 1950s, early 1960s. A show that went off the air in 1963 called Leave It to Beaver. Now there was even more of a show where you got, wow, you know, everything just seemed to kind of click, you know, and there was always this interaction, these perfect interactions that the father or the mother would have with the kids and with the neighbors that, of course, never seemed to quite meet that expectation that you would encounter in your own real life. And that would always, I guess, for me, kind of be a quandary. In some ways, I guess you could say I was always a perfectionist and looked at that as the ideal. but all it was television, people acting, right? Telling the story of a time long ago. Now, I had a half-brother named John, and hey, here we see Wally and the Beaver, Cleaver, right? And so I kind of had that thing of, wow, hey, I'm kind of in a similar role because I'm a big brother to my half-brother John. Now I'm going to go ahead and kind of spoil it for you and tell you the fact that I only knew my brother as well as I would have liked in the 1980s, okay? There would later on be a divorce. Later on we would split, and he would unfortunately, he would die young, okay? So at that time, though, I really was aspiring to be the best big brother I could be in the short period of time I ultimately would have. But we spent a lot of time watching TV. Hey, I like to watch Gilligan's Island, you know? And the interesting thing about that show was that it was filmed in black and white and color, so depending upon what was broadcasted on a given day, you might see it in black and white or you might see it in color. And, you know, the interesting thing about that show I really enjoyed was from the minute it started to the minute it ended, you had kind of a neat musical component to it. You had the theme songs at the beginning and the end. And you also, too, had a lot of interesting, even though the island shots were rather limited, you had kind of a really strong opening and a really strong closing. And, you know, you had Gilligan and the Skipper, too, a millionaire and his wife, a movie star, the Professor and Mary Ann, all on Gilligan's Island, right? And so they're trying to get off this island. And the one character I could really relate to was the Professor. The Professor was always trying to find a way, using his smarts, his intellect, fiddling with the radio to try to get everyone off the island. Now, I would just sit there day after day going, wow, I can't believe these people can't get off this island, you know, and you got such a unique fun out of the characters. The millionaire and his wife, the movie star. So, but hey, holy sitcom, Batman. There's got to be something beyond stale sitcoms. Well, there was a 1960s TV show that I used to watch all the time, Batman. Boy, I loved that show. The Batmobile, the Batcave, Batman and Robin, Commissioner Gordon, the police chief. I would get real excited watching these great shows. And all of these were very, very, for its time, very wholesome shows. Not like what we would see today. Now, of course, I was restricted off cable unless I was in a very supervised kind of household. And it was kind of one of those things. But I had such a great enjoyment because back then you had a lot of great costumes, set design. It wasn't all, at least at this point, wasn't all CGI, and it was very much, you kind of had your thing during the afternoon. You would come home and go, hey, I'm going to watch some adventures today. You'd get excited at the end of the day going like, hey, school's over. I can really have some fun and watch a little TV before I went off to play out in the yard with my half-brother. So now the one thing that really, I'll tell you, the big villain on Batman that would freak me out for whatever reason was a penguin. He'd go, rah, 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 rah. They were really good, and you would get these incredible moments where they would come out into the show, and you go, oh man, you know, it was in some ways, if you look back, I was looking at what would have been first premiere shows in the 1960s. I was looking years later in the 1980s. So it was really neat. You really kind of got interested in the superheroes and the villains. And your mind would really get into it, and you go, wow. Now every once in a while, though, there'd be an after-school special. And it would kind of interrupt my my watching, because every once in a while, my stepmother would go, hey, you want to watch a movie? Okay, all right. And it would be an after-school special. Now, these after-school specials had some really, some very interesting and unique themes, because they were very, anti-drinking, anti-drugs. I'll never forget the day that and you would watch these after-school specials, not in the kitchen, but out in the living room, some bigger screen, and one day I watched a portrayal of a woman jumping, a young girl, a young teenager, jumping off a window after supposedly taking, in the film, taking angel dust. And you go, oh, gosh, I'll tell you, that'll really get you going. But there are all these different things, particularly drunk driving was a big thing at the time. I remember watching a movie that it was really big on, peer pressure, talking about people trying to fit in, and then what ends up being something very simple, is turns catastrophic and it ruins the whole thing, right? So these were in some ways you had some features of reality, right? But you had some levels of fear, and in some ways, for someone like me, it could be somewhat effective, but fun though. Because in some ways you were at a younger age kind of getting exposed to what you would be down the road seeing in the future. And again, in an attempt to try to be wholesome, but in some ways a kind of a wake-up call for you, showing you that your life may end up getting more complex. Now, in some ways, though, in the future. Now, of course, looking back to the past, in the 1960s, the Flintstones were big. They were kind of like the Simpsons. If you think of the Simpsons, the Flintstones back then. And you always had the interplay between Fred and his neighbor, Barney, a rebel. And they're all crammed into this to the car. And it's all, of course, a Stone Age theme. The modern Stone Age family, right? Now, I would start really watching a lot of animation. Some of it was classical stuff like Tom and Jerry. In some ways, I guess I could describe my relationship with my brother at the time with kind of the way it was. There were times like Tom and Jerry, they'd be running around and at each other's throats, but at some points they would kind of team up to deal with challenges as they came up. So, but it was unique because in that animation, I was looking at stuff that was even older and that was even more, in some ways, different. But I really would get a kick out of the animation from the past. Every once in a while, Popeye, for example. I really got into Popeye, and then at one point, seeing a long time ago the live action movie that starred Robin Williams, and how that was neat. The one thing I got off of it was nothing could ever get Popeye the Sailor Man down. And he was, of course, always trying to rescue Olive Oyl. And they had all these unique characters in the cartoons. And of course, the big thing, of course, what was Popeye powered by? He was powered by spinach. And I was lucky in a sense of, hey, I really liked spinach at the time. So it was kind of cool. And you kind of have that interplay between, hey, what gets you going, right? So a really neat, kind of a neat thing. I even liked Wimpy, he loved his hamburgers, right? So you would kind of get these older animation from a different time. But you got to remember, you're watching it in the 1980s. And here you get a really big, wide view of what generally is termed the Popeye family. And you get some of the figures that I recognize, some of the more obscure figures, but he was always rescuing Olive Oyl from what they would run into, the misadventures they would run into, and Bluto later called Brutus in the later cartoons. And of course there was always Bugs Bunny and the Roadrunner, but I was more into these cartoons. So I had a wealth of imagery, I guess you could say, from a period of time from going, I guess you could almost go as far back as the 40s, the 50s, and certainly in the 60s. Now, along came He-Man and Masters of the Universe, and you would get, this is where you start to get the link between the animation and the toys you could get at the store. Now, of course, unfortunately, the toys I got at the store were rather sparing. Okay, it was made to be a very big deal if I could get anything. I did at one point have a He-Man figure where I could twist around and could really, really have fun. And boy, I would really get immersed into He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. A very powerful animation. And it was the one animation, the one cartoon that I think that John, TJ, and I, we really, really, really loved. It was really one of those where I think it was at 4 o'clock. And I mean, life revolved around 4 o'clock. Boom, I can't be late. But here you get, and this, you see, hey, they're all the folks in front of Castle Grayskull, and you got Skeletor, you got Man-at-Arms, You got Orko. You got She-Ra, who would actually have a spin-off show, which I at 4:30 I was like, okay, He-Man's done. I'm not going to watch She-Ra. But it. You think back to these things. If you think about the hours that you spent watching, and of course, remember, I'm not even talking about the commercials or the public service announcements that you would see throughout. But in this, you would begin to see a tie-in between the animation and the actual physical toys that you would try to get your almost unwilling stepmother and father to get. But hey, they viewed things a little bit different, and I never really would ever have a whole bunch of toys. I never developed some sort of collectible of toys. I just watched the TV, and there was Prince Adam, and he would say, "By the power, I have the power." By the power of Grayskull, I have the power. And boy, again, great animation because you got that lighting, you got that magical moment. Again, you had that opening, a powerful opening in the show. I guess I kind of admired some of the neat stuff that I got. And again, you have to a thing to keep in mind too is I wasn't watching this on some huge screen. It was a small screen that could fit onto maybe a third of a kitchen table. But the neat thing about too also was always in the afternoon the lights were off, so you got more of the lighting, and you go, wow, hey, that's cool, And they would go off on all these adventures, and the 1980s were, just a real fun time. So, and again, something I could share, and then another thing that I could share in a lot of these things, and this is one that really blasted forward into movies. Real big movies and real big things was Transformers. And I managed to get a couple Transformers. Of course, none of these toys ever survived the divorce. None of my toys ever really made it out of the 1989 move from my dad's girlfriend's place. And I won't go into that, but, I won't go into that. But hey, I would give anything to have some of those Transformers the few Transformers that I had, to have them in my hands again. So all I'm left with really are the show, and so here we kind of got in this case, a retrospective of the first season, and again, you would start to see more of a tie-in with the toys, kind of go get the toys, but you could really, you would have them to be watching a cartoon, so you'd be kind of like fooling around with them on the kitchen table, and again, another one where I had a lot of enjoyment. Because a commonality that my half brother and I shared. I'll call him my brother because in my heart he was, but by relation he was like my half brother. But he'll always in my heart be my full brother, right? And so, but he had a show. He was all into G.I. Joe. He was really into G.I. Joe. I'm like, I'm not really into it. But one thing to remember about G.I. Joe, and then eventually I'm going to do a show about Saturday morning. Cartoons will be it's itself an incredible epic show that I plan to do. But a lot of these shows had really good, I think, genuine good moral messages. Now, yeah, you could say some it's PSA disguised, public service announcement disguised as a cartoon here or there, right? But I would still also too, I would get these great old 1970s TV shows that booted in the 70s, early 80s, and I would get for the first time in my life exposed to later on in the TV sitcom format to Mork and Mindy and Robin Williams and the brilliance of Robin Williams. Now here, you're thinking Mork and Mindy, okay, it's Pam Dawber, Robin Williams playing folks living in Colorado. Now here's where it gets interesting because I admired Robin Williams and the acting and the character Mort from Ork that he played so well, and it was such a playoff with him and Pam Dawber in this show that I just you admire people, right? And he was the one comedian throughout. I guess you could almost say throughout my life that I admired, and partly to my detriment. Especially at Crown Point Elementary, and trying to kind of relate to people and help relate to my family. There were times I would get really all goofy and try to be like Mork from Ork, right? When you think about your 10, 11 years old, you're really trying to put your stamp out on the world. You kind of project yourself out in the world, and you kind of admire people. It was a really funny show. And I would drive my grandparents out at they lived in a trailer out off Black Creek in Clay County, and I'd drive them crazy. And my grandfather couldn't stand it because I'd be like, okay, it's time to work from work, and I would do just kind of like he would. I would like throw my head first into a couch or a chair and go, okay, I'm from work. And my grandmother would say, he's going to break his neck. He's going to break his neck. You stop doing that, you're going to break your neck. And then what are you going to do? She said, you're going to break your neck, and then what are you going to do? But hey, I'm just being Mork from work, right? Of course, we all know Robin Williams would have been taken care of fine if he had dislocated a little bit. But I was always careful, and I managed it. But I always really kind of got a kick out of the pratfall. And to me, this was the essence of Robin Williams. I guess maybe this ultimately ends up becoming more of a tribute to Robin Williams and to the comedy that he was able to do. And as a kid, you get such incredible energy. And then also, too, a lot of these shows would motivate me later on, whether it was out at my grandparents' or I was watching on TV at the house in the kitchen. It would always end with, hey, okay, it's time for you to jump outside and go off and have some adventures with my brother, with my half-brother, with TJ. So, or at my grandparents', I was alone there. Now, speaking of being alone, you see WTLV 12, and there was a dramatic break that happened in February 1988. My family split, my family divorced, and before I knew it, I was living in an apartment off Old St. Augustine Road with my father and my grandmother. And so one of the shows that I would start watching TV alone, or my grandmother might be in and out, or we'd be watching TV in the living room. It was a distinctly different experience. And I don't know, for whatever reason, I guess because I was growing up, I'd watch What's Happening, an old shows from the 70s. And I used to really get a kick out of the character played by Ernest Thomas, and the character Rerun, and Shirley the waitress. And I really, for whatever reason, I really enjoyed the show, and I really enjoyed Good Times, and all the different shows that would be on. But I was starting to move, I guess you could say I was starting to move off of UHF for a while onto VHF, for those of you out there who get the TV reference. Later on, I'd start watching more news. I would start listening to the radio more. My dad gave me kind of stereo system for a while, and I'd start listening to music. I started getting more attuned to different things. But I guess you could say there was always still some great programming. Now, in 1990, I moved into this really nice house with just me and my dad. My grandmother went on to just live alone, basically. Taking care of herself, and then my uncle helping her out. And then later on, we'd visit and all. But towards the end, this is one of the last sitcoms I would watch in the afternoon. Well, actually, the next to the last one I would watch. It's called Small Wonder. I, for whatever reason, was really intrigued by it. It wasn't really exactly the best show, and even I was getting older. Sitcoms were kind of wearing on me by this point. And also, too, what I had was something that was unique. And so I watched it. It was kind of interesting. They do these little effects with her and all. And one of the last big sitcoms that I was really into watching in the afternoon were reruns of Alf. I didn't get to watch it in first run in the 80s because I was a kid and I had to be here or there or whatever in the evenings. I really enjoyed Alf, and that was probably one of the last big afternoon sitcoms that I really would watch. And he was just so sarcastic and so had such snark, and he was always kind of joking on the family and kind of mocking some of the real stupid things people would kind of get involved in. And I mean, Alf fit with my personality by that point really good. But by January of 1990, my dad hooked in cable into both TV sets at the new house, and I had exposure to everything. You name it, I got it. MTV, Kurt Cobain, Nirvana, Smells Like Teen Spirit, CNN, the fall of the Soviet Union, the Iraq War. All this stuff would start pouring through the TV, and I was getting older. And computing was coming, and I started to be on the computer. I started to play SimCity. All of a sudden, my afternoons were different. Also, too, the stress of homework, advanced placement colleges, college placement exams in the high school, studying math, trying to graduate out of high school so I could get into community college, go to Florida State. Wow, all of a sudden, boom, the TV becomes different, and your life becomes different. Well, I kind of took you down memory lane today, and I guess I shared a little bit of myself with you today. But didn't we all in the 80s have unique. We had our unique experiences, but in some ways, the TV brought us together in some very common experiences, things that later on we would get such enjoyment out of later, and we can even look back with fondness. And in those moments, in those hours, in those times I spent, I was able to have the couple years that I had with my brother John, my half brother John, TJ, and the experiences that I did have. And I'll tell you one thing: I was raised as good as I could be, but I valued the experiences I had. I valued the time that I had. I felt like I got a lot out of it. And so you know what? It worked out just fine. Well, hey, I got a lot more to bring you on this new Memories for the People channel. I want to encourage you to please subscribe, please watch, and let me know what you think. Tell me what you think about some of the things that you saw. A lot of this is from a Jacksonville-Florida perspective in the 80s, so probably maybe the way you saw things might have been a little bit different. But I hope you enjoy it. I wish you the best. Take it easy. Stay tuned. See you later. Take it easy. Bye.